All right, hey everybody, it's time for another edition of Left on the Desk, and this time we are looking at Hebrews chapter 2, verses 5 through 18. And in Hebrews chapter 2, verses 5 through 18, we looked at the idea of a radical brotherhood that God creates through his Son, Jesus Christ, really built on the anchor of the entire passage in Hebrews chapter 2, verse 10, that the ultimate purpose of Christ's death and his suffering was to bring many sons to glory. And so, as we think about that and we look at that, there's a couple of things to look at with regards to the weight of the radical sacrifice that Jesus provides for us, and also the radical, very different type of brotherhood that you see that exists here in Hebrews chapter 2. So in Hebrews chapter 2, we're going to be building upon and seeing something that's going to happen in chapter 3 that we're going to see later, is that, there is a sense of what God is creating here is a new sense of family, a family that is created with Jesus being the central figure of that family. And as such, in his sacrifice, there's something that happens here that Jesus does that's very important for us to understand, but it also plays into what we see for ourselves with regards to being sons and daughters of glory. When the preacher says in Hebrews 10 that Jesus' purpose is to bring many sons to glory, we need to see that in full view of what it looks like and the station that God gives us in life. So, as we see the preacher interpreting Psalm 8, indicating what is man that you are mindful of him, or the Son of Man that you care for him, you have made him a little lower than the angels, you have crowned him with glory and with honor, putting everything in subjection under his feet. Now, there is a very important teaching here that not only points us to the reality of our calling to be sons of glory, but also it connects to our responsibility of what it looks like to be sons of glory living here in the world. So, at the end of Hebrews, in that exposition of Psalm 8, in Hebrews 2:8, he says that everything is put under subjection under his feet. So, referring to Jesus' feet. And then he goes on to say that for a little while he's made lower than the angels and everything is not in subjection to him yet. But consider what that looks like for humanity. So, if you take the angels, Jesus has a glory that is above theirs. We've already affirmed that and we've seen that in Hebrews chapter 1. But he's in glory. Ultimately, his station in life is in glory. So he's here, angels are here. For a time, he makes himself lower than the angels in order to bring many sons to glory. The importance of that is to understand our station and what God calls us to here versus what he calls us to in eternity. On this side of heaven, we find ourselves, because of our sin, in a lower state than the angels. But if we're going to be returned to glory, that must imply that there is going to be a time in which our authority will supersede that of the angels, that he is lifting us to a higher station. So when he says things will be subject to the Son, at some point in eternity, not only will all things be subject to the Son, but our inheritance is also one in which, as co-heirs with Christ, that all things will be subject to us to some degree. We will still have a subjection under the Son. We will not ever reign and rule over and above Jesus Christ. That's not what I'm saying. But what we do see is a return in some sense to what we saw in the garden. In the Garden of Eden, God had put man in a particular station in which all things were in subjection under him. When God created man, he said, be fruitful and multiply and subdue the earth. In other words, have the things on earth in subjection under you. Rule them, have authority over them. And this idea of being put under subjection under Jesus' feet is also a return to our station and where God had what God originally intended for us. Here's why that's important. So when I was coaching high school, and we'd have a football player who would play youth football and scored a lot of touchdowns when he was playing youth football, and then moved to our high school team, and they would score their first touchdown as a high school player, and they would always act like a clown. They'd be foolish. And I would always say the same thing to them upon that first touchdown. I would say to them, act like you've been here before. Act like you've done this before. And in some sense, that's a word for us as we see this being in subjection under, all things being under subjection to the Son, and ultimately they will be in subjection to us to some degree, that we need to live like we've been there before. In other words, we need to learn to live like sons of glory now. One of the things that I often hear, which I think is an overcorrection in our Christian life, is to imply in some way that in coming in our relationship with Jesus, that we practically become nothing. Well, in light of Jesus, absolutely. That there is a glory that Jesus has that we don't have. That is absolutely true. But I've heard people refer to themselves as worms, as nothing, as, I'm nothing in relationship to God. Well, that's not true. That's a false notion. You have a station underneath Jesus, but you are certainly not nothing. You're a son of glory. So don't speak of yourself in a way that marginalizes that reality, that you are a son of glory. Refer to yourself as a son of glory, but also live into that reality. And so that's something that you see in this particular passage, and it's been something of debate by theologians over the years, that in that phrase, in subjection, is it just referring to Christ, or is it referring to all of humanity, that at some point all things will be in subjection not only to the Son, but also to us? And the fact that you connect together the idea that God is going to put everything under Jesus' feet, that we are to inherit salvation and be co-heirs with him, and we will be sons of glory, you can make that connection. So that's something that's important to see. Also, in my sermon this week, I made reference to Galatians 5:1, and looking at the idea that to fear death is to be subject to slavery. And in Galatians 5:1, Paul says that it is for freedom that Christ has set us free, therefore no longer submit to a yoke of slavery. Now, you may see that and you say, well, you're using that verse out of context, because in Galatians chapter 5, the problem with the Galatians was a subject to the slavery of the law. And that is 100% true. When Paul is talking to the Galatians, the problem of slavery that he is addressing is a problem of slavery to the law, specifically whether or not you should be circumcised or not. Now, but when Christ dies to set us free, one of the things to note, and so when we look at Scripture, we have to look at the narrow context, the broader context, and the whole context. In other words, what is God saying in his word in the narrow context, centered around what we see directly around the text? But then in the broader context, what is he saying in the broader context of the Christian life? And in the whole context, how does what he is saying in this particular passage, how does it weigh in or inform the rest of Scripture? And in this case, it does. There is a narrow context in which Paul in Galatians chapter 5 is talking about the slavery of the law, but in the book of Hebrews, the preacher identifies a different form of slavery, the slavery to the fear of death. So in that case, you can, with validity, apply Galatians chapter 5, verse 1 to Hebrews chapter 2 and say Christ died to set you free from a slavery to that particular bondage, in this case, a bondage of the fear of death. And so it's important for us to understand and realize what that looks like for us, especially in this modern context. as we look at our current response to the pandemic, for example, we see ourselves in many ways subjecting ourselves to the fear of slavery. There is a difference between preventing death and fearing death. There is a sense of, when I wear a mask, I'm not saying that I fear death. What I'm saying is I'm going to do what I can in order to prevent death, but I'm going to do it in a way that says that gathering as the saints together with God's people is something that is ultimately going to cause a different sort of death in me, because I lose relationships, I lose continuity with the family of God, I lose that connecting point of fellowship that God has wired us for, and as such, I'm not willing to choose this death over that death. And so I'm going to try to prevent death, but I'm going to do so in a way that says, I'm not going to let this thing rule my life. I'm not going to make it a source of fear for me that I will not live according to what God has called me to do. And so that's a very, I know, controversial teaching right now, but it's something nonetheless that we do have to say. If we're going to be followers of Jesus Christ, we have to let the scriptures speak. And as the scriptures speak, we either are going to say we affirm what Jesus does and we believe it, or we're going to say, yeah, God, Jesus, that didn't work for me. It works for everybody else, but it doesn't work for me. And again, I said it in my sermon, this is a very dangerous game to play with God. So we have to understand and make sure that as we look at this issue of the fear of death, that when our radical brotherhood requires a radical sacrifice, and when we look at our fear of death, part of that sacrifice, and for the sake of our brotherhood, is to say that the family of God matters enough that we have to make some hard decisions about certain things, the way that we live our lives. And this is just one of them. And so there's some things for you to look at as you're studying the text. Those are a few things that were left on the desk for me this week. And I hope that you'll see just the radical nature of the brotherhood that God creates in our collective body of being followers of Jesus Christ, because it's important for us to be able to see those things and note them in order to be better together. That really is ultimately what God calls us to. And so as you see that, see what it looks like in your own life to make those whatever sacrifices that you need to make in order to be a part of this radical brotherhood of what God calls the family of God. And that's something that we're going to look at as we push into chapter 3 next week. God bless you. Have a great week.